Hi, my name is Beryl Cook and I'm Sam Biggs's mother and the daughter of Alan Cook.
So what can you tell me about Sam's familial relation to communism and the history of communism versus capitalism?
Well, as I said to you, I think it's an interesting story because the story of your grandmother and your grandfather is really a crossover. Your grandmother grew up in a village in Malaya when it was a British colony. And it was a centre for finance and shipping, and everyone was very interested in the rubber plantations and the tin that was being exported all over the world. It was a time when Japan also became very highly aggressive and expansionary and started to wage a war. And they arrived down in Malaya because they were very interested also in those resources and the fact it was a location for a port. The British were very arrogant and never thought that Japan could get through Malaysia, let alone reach Singapore. So the Japanese invaded Malaya in 1941, and it was part of their push to create this great East Asian economic zone, and underneath their rule, of course. Your grandmother was a very young girl then, and she remembers that when they came, she was probably about 6 years old, and the whole family and all the village had to go on the run in the jungle, and they ran for weeks on end, running with a tin of biscuits to escape the invading Japanese. Once the Japanese had control of Malaya, the people slowly came back to the towns and villages, and it was a tough life, and they did whatever they had to do to survive. During that time, a resistance sprang up, and the Malays joined forces with the British, Australian, and Chinese fighters, and eventually they repelled the Japanese about 4 years later. But ironically, there was then again another split. The Malays, the Brits, and the Australians were suddenly fighting against the so-called Chinese communist terrorists, who became known as the CTs, to get them out. This period in history is called the Malayan Emergency, and another interesting thing is that it wasn't called a war because the rich plantation owners convinced the British government not to call it a war. If it was a war, then the insurers would refuse to insure them, and that's why today you see it called the Malayan Emergency. So my father, your grandfather, was recruited to Malaya as an army major, and he was asked to set up a home guard and bring together tens of thousands of Malays and Indians and Chinese from all across Malaya, from villages, rubber plantations and tin mines, along with local bush people in the mountain jungles who still hunted with spears. Your grandfather had a $1 million budget then, which in those days was huge, and his job was to set up and train and arm a home guard and to lead jungle expeditions to hunt the CTs, or the communist terrorists, who previously had been their allies. So during this time in Malaya, your grandfather met your grandmother, who was a nurse. And they got together and eventually married and came back to Australia in the late 1950s. And I remember that even years later, your grandfather would still talk about how the communists aimed to undermine democracy and freedom and take over, and how he had to be careful of these extreme left views. And the communists, as far as he's concerned, were still a threat to Australia and democracy. Just a few years ago, though, I went back to Malaya and I was talking to, it's now Malaysia, and I was talking to the family, and I discovered something that I doubt your grandfather knew. It turns out that his mother-in-law was a communist sympathiser, and yet here he was tasked with hunting the communist terrorists, especially in the jungle. Your great-grandmother, his mother-in-law, had 3 small dots tattooed on her hand, which was a secret signal that the communist supporters used to recognise each other. Other than that, we don't know much about your great-grandma. Now, we know that all of your great-grandparents on both sides were from China, and they left southern China with their families because, like most Chinese from Guangzhou at the time, they were merchants and small business people. I remember hearing that everyone's property was seized by the Communist Party, and people who wanted to be able to work and trade and create what they saw as better lives for themselves and their children just up and left with whatever they could carry. They talked about what happened in China and about people disappearing or being killed. You weren't free to talk about politics, and you certainly couldn't criticise the party. You had to be quiet and do what you were told. And you couldn't earn more by working harder than other people because the idea was everything should be collectively owned. Well, years later, Grandma wouldn't go to China even when I asked her to go and visit the Great Wall as a tourist because she said they might never let you go. You know, as a small child, she was always told that if you're Chinese, they always considered you Chinese, they could keep you and you might not be allowed to leave.
Wow, thank you so much for all that. That's very interesting and very enlightening. Thank you so much.